Disability services in New Haven County Public Schools has improved over the years through parents and advocates like the Special Education PTA, which raises awareness for students in need of accommodation. Quinnipiac University professor, administrative director of the honors program, and chair of the Hampden Board of Education, Melissa Kaplan, is a strong ally for students in need of special education.
I think that going forward, any plans that the Hampden School District has to make sure that we support our most vulnerable students, and they really need to be the forefront of any conversation that we have. Being a parent of a child who has diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety, I approach this from both a Board of Ed member but also a parent, and I see in terms of him going through the system and my own concerns and making sure that students like my son are cared for and recognized and valued and not underestimated how brilliant these students are. And I think that's also sometimes an issue as well. Just because you think a little differently, you work around problems a little differently, doesn't mean that you aren't absolutely brilliant.
Like Kaplan, Quinnipiac student teachers have also been assisting students in their classes who require extra attention. Graduate student Erin Jones, who works at Pond Hill School in Wallingford, Connecticut, spoke of her experience working with students over the last 2 years.
The one student who came from a different school where he was labeled as a behavior issue, but he's not. Like, he very clearly has autism, and that set him back a lot. Like, he wasn't receiving the services he needed, which was unfortunate. And he was in an isolation class, so he was only with 3 other students, and they were more behavioral, so that presented with a lot of challenges too. Like, he experienced some bullying, didn't receive the proper academic services. So when he came to us in November, he was probably at like a kindergarten, first grade academic level, especially in reading. He's moved up to like mid-second grade level now in just the few months that he's been with us, which has like been great growth.
Undergraduate student Natasha Hoffner, who works at the K-8 Fairhaven School in New Haven, Connecticut, has had similar experiences to that of Jones.
Last semester when I was in another classroom, there was basically an entire classroom that was like filled with students that were either undiagnosed disability or they ended up having one, and a lot of the paraprofessionals had to come in and like assist with them most of the time. And they would just act out. There was a student who like sharpened his pencil and would like throw it at the teacher, or, like, he got a little physical. And there were other ones that just were like distractions to other students. But when the para came, usually it was much easier, but before that, the classroom was like really disruptive.
Undergraduate student Cameron Sell, who also works at Fairhaven School in New Haven, spoke of how she works around students with disabilities in her classroom.
I think number one is patience is key. Obviously, those students, they have a learning disability, and they can't control what their behavior is, and that's not their fault. And I think you have to realize that and take a breath and focus on what their needs are specifically, because every child is different, and you take the tools that you have in the classroom, pull them aside, get help from other teachers, learn from others. I think that's a huge important thing, and figure out ways to help that student, because that's what you're there for. You're also not there to just like put that student down. You're there to help them and guide them in the best way possible. I am dyslexic myself, so I had special education throughout my whole education career. So with that experience, it has helped me a lot, and I've changed for the better because of it.
Co-founder of the Hampden SEPTA, Venice Michelson, shared her difficult experience fighting for her son's right to accommodations.
I have one son. My son, he's 11 and autistic. When it comes to me and in terms of whether I needed to fight, yes, of course. I fought from the very beginning. I had to move from Brooklyn, which I loved, because my son wasn't getting what he needed. And I came back to my hometown, which I did not want to do, but it was what he needed. Having a fight with birth to 3, not so much with birth to 3, but still having a fight for services, having to go through all of these situations where people say that they understand, right? Because his aggression and frustration, management, rigidity, and all that stuff, and having people, just getting kicked out of everything, and how do you fight for your kid while also understanding that there's harm that's done. And how do you just sort of say, like, we have to stick through this with him? And also, being aware of the complications of ABA, and that ABA is really the only thing that's offered. It's the only option for families, but it also has its problems, and you have to be vigilant. And if you're not vigilant, then who knows what's going to happen to your kid, right? So even the supports are problematic.
A question on the minds of disability services advocates is whether the town budget is being fairly allocated to students in need. Public records show that $91 million of the $262 million Hamden Town budget, $192 million of the $606 million New Haven Town budget, and $106 million of the $177 million Wallingford Town budget has been put toward Board of Education funding.
It is a very complex system of support. But it also is the largest portion of the town's Board of Ed budget is for our special ed students. We spend a lot more money when we cannot provide services to students and we have to outplace them. And that also is much harder on families when we can't provide those services in town. So one of our long-term goals is making sure that we keep those students in town to provide them with those services. And it's also economically smart to do so. To me, it's a win-win when we're able to do things like that.
But I feel like at my school, I think it is like the students that need it receive the proper services and go through testing. But at other schools during like my field study, where I feel like it probably wasn't allocated fairly, like that students needed the services and they weren't receiving them. So like I don't know all the specifics of the budget and everything, but I've seen it been allocated unfairly at other schools, I feel.
It's being addressed, but some of the students I think need a little bit more help than like they're being given. And I do think specifically within like the area that I'm placed for my like field study program, there are a higher like amount of kids that would necessarily qualify for special education, or at least would need like assisted services just for like behavioral issues or something like that. So I think there's always room for like, progress, but I think they're doing the most that they can with what they're given.
Underfunding in special education, I think it's unfortunate that there isn't a lot of money going into special education. Those students matter just as much as the students that are in general ed classrooms. Like I mentioned before, I have dyslexia, so I was the student getting pulled out and getting help, and it was very beneficial for me. My parents were very happy with the success rate it had on me, and I think money should be going towards special education so we can give the students the right resources for their specific needs.
We're dealing with decades of mismanagement with pensions, and it's going to take a while to dig out of that. But if my money's going to be spent on anything, like I don't even care about running over a pothole, like send all the money to our kids. And no, of course, special education isn't getting it. I'm hopeful that once our current superintendent is retiring, and I'm hopeful that once he is gone, that Chris Malillo will get the job and that he will do a much better job of allocating money towards special education. I'm thrilled that Melissa is on our BOE. I think she does a very good job at focusing on special education. She's obviously incredible at this. So I'm really glad that we have that representation.
Accommodations provided by the public schools for students usually include individualized education plans, 504 plans, and the assistance of paraprofessionals.
But legally, we have to make sure that we are able to meet the needs of every single student who has an IEP or a 504 plan. That's legally mandated. We are obligated to make sure that those students are taken care of, not just in our school, but actually the entire town. So even if students choose not to go to the Hampton Public Schools, we are still responsible, even in their other schools, to provide services like testing and other types of resources available to those students. So we're talking about thousands upon thousands of students, and this is from kindergarten all the way until 12th grade, and we even have programs post high school graduation in which we continue to support students.
I know that they have IEPs and like special education programs for them, so IEPs, individualized education programs. And I know they work a lot alongside the parents in order to like really make sure that they're the best fitted form of accommodations for the students, and they definitely have like social workers, counselors, and also a lot of like paraprofessionals or a decent amount at hand that can help the students, and usually the teachers are like of the utmost like help for the students.
I know that right now from one of my professors at QU, they explain that paraprofessionals are they're decreasing in the amount of people that are open to being a paraprofessional. So that's been really hard on schools to try and find paraprofessionals and subs as well. But I think that they do have enough at Fairhaven, but I think there are classrooms, like in last semester in my field study, there wasn't a paraprofessional in the room and they definitely needed one. They had 4 students in there that needed some help. In my field study now, I do see 3 students that have 504 plans. I think there's 1 student that's high functioning, autism. Another student is deaf, so they have a hearing aid.
You know, finding the right para, and then once you find the right para, then he gets too attached. So then you have to make sure that he doesn't get too attached to somebody, and you have to make sure that they're all doing the right thing. You have to make sure that they're taking the data, but then you don't want the data to be the only focus because he's a person, and then you don't, you know, it's this ping pong game of just constant stuff. Now I'm lucky in that he does have, you know, he's in a school now where there's a huge, like the student to teacher ratio is really dramatically different than anything he's going to get here in the public school system.
Additionally, there are outside resources available to students who require more care than schools are able to provide. SEPTA is working to raise awareness for people with disabilities, especially in regard to the education of children with disabilities.
And I owe so much to the special education PTA. These parents have been instrumental, and so anytime that the Board of Ed has any kind of conversation regarding our special ed students, I make sure that they're part of the conversation. We need to hear their voices. It allows us to better serve the community when we do.
We need people who can represent us and who continue to hear us. We need to be able to make the noise as best as we can and support each other, right? SEPTA is also about parents supporting each other when they're struggling, because parents of kids with disabilities are going to struggle more. They just are. It's harder. You know, your kids need more, and that's harder. Everybody runs out of spoons, you know? So
New Haven County Public Schools continue to implement strategies to aid students in need of specialized education, but there is always room for innovative ideas to raise awareness and break the stigma toward people with disabilities.